Across the Margin.
Across the Margin podcast.
Welcome to Across the Margin, the podcast, where we take you beyond the margin, behind the scenes of the online magazine, and deeper into the stories. I'm your host, Michael Shields, and before we get going, I do want to mention once again that this podcast is part of the Osiris Network. Osiris is a growing community of arts, music, and culture podcast, connecting fans of the arts like you with conversation, commentary, and a whole slew of captivating podcasts. Check out osirispod.com for more great podcasts. So I have a great podcast for you today. I'm real excited about this. It's we're going to be talking about borders today, and specifically the investigative documentary video series entitled Borders that investigates life at the edge of nations. It's a series hosted by impassioned Emmy-nominated producer Johnny Harris, who I was lucky enough to speak to in an interview that I'm going to have for you here in a moment. Borders features stories from 6 borders around the world, examining the human stories behind physical and political borders, and how the lines used to apportion the planet play a decisive role in the past, present, and future of billions actually, of lives. Their tagline, it's pretty poignant. If you want to know a country's deepest fear, look at its borders. I was first put onto the Borders series by my little brother. He annually travels to Haiti in humanitarian aid. He heads down there, I believe, with his church, and he's always coming back, telling me stories. Just how troubling some of the things he comes upon down there. He's always trying to teach and educate me and anyone in his life about what's happening down there. And so one night he actually shared with me the first episode of the Borders series, which highlights Haitian and Dominican Republic relations, and it focuses in on this busy market economy on their borders, where tensions rise when Haitians attempt to cross and sell their goods, and they're denied or oppressed in different ways. And within minutes of watching, I was floored, and that very evening, I fell into a deep and profoundly affecting and ultimately important whole, reeling through all 6 episodes in a row. They're about 15 minutes each, and just packed with information. One's at the border of North Korea and Japan. Another deals with Spain and Morocco. One is about China and Nepal. There's one about the Arctic Circle and this Norwegian group of islands between the mainland and Norway and the North Pole. It focuses in a lot about Russia and their priorities there. It's wild. And then there's one about the United States, Mexico, and Central America. That's incredibly relevant to a lot of the news we hear today. But I wasn't just floored by all these stories. It was Johnny's personal reflections. The host, Johnny Harris, who's with us here today, his personal reflections, the cinematography of the whole thing, which he's involved with. He's not only a journalist, he's well versed in production, and it's amazing how he pieces those two worlds together and gets it done. So I believe the stories that are told on Borders are entirely important, can help all of us better understand the world around us, and in a way that in a way that could potentially lead to some positive changes. It's really eye-opening, and because of that, I just really I needed to talk to Johnny. I hunted him down, and I'm entirely privileged to share my interview with Johnny Harris. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for making the time amid all your travel, your work. Truly appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to be here.
Fantastic. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background leads you, gives you this unique skill set as both a videographer and in film production, and in being so informed with complex foreign policy to be able to tell these stories so effectively.
Yeah, so I started video when I was a kid. I grew up always with a camcorder and stuff, and that was always an interest, making videos at home and such. When I got into college, I started to think of video as like a childhood thing that I, wasn't going to ever really pursue. I kind of dabbled in one film class my freshman year of college, and it was a lot about, critique and theory, and it wasn't about, having your hands on the camera. And that kind of just turned me off of cinematography and film altogether. And I was like, well, this was a fun thing when I was a kid.
Yeah.
It's time to grow up and study some adult thing, and that was international relations for me.
You've always been fascinated with
and I didn't even know if I was fascinated. It just sounded so cool.
Yeah,
it was just like international, and I knew nothing.
It sounds like travel would be involved,
yeah, exactly.
right there.
It sounds like, do you travel full time if you're an international relations person?
Little did
that
you know.
literally was my impulse. Was like, I want to do this strictly because it sounds good.
Yeah.
So I studied international relations and realized I actually really liked it. It was a really interesting, learning about foreign policy and things. And then when I got out to DC, I realized that there were so many other international relations graduates who were way smarter and way more connected and way better than me that I was not going to find a job being like, I'm just another of the million international relations student coming to DC. So that is when I started to really tap in to the video skills, and I had been kind of cultivating them as a side hobby.
Yeah.
On the side, and same with graphics and motion graphics and animation and stuff. I'd always kind of played around with that stuff as a hobby, but now I was in a situation where, out of survival, I had to use those skills in order to get a job, and that's kind of why there's this weird hybrid of like international affairs mixed with these technical skills. It was almost out of survival, out of supply and demand. There just wasn't any. There was too much supply of international relations people and not enough of video, and so I pivoted because of that.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing how you married them together, and especially for this project. And like I was telling you before we even started this series really affected me. It's really it was eye opening, and I've learned so much. And I just
great to hear.
And how did it come about? I've been personally fascinated with like the imaginary lines that divide us, and I was wondering where you got the idea to tell these affecting stories of the turmoil that exists at these manufactured lines.
Yeah, so I think it started. I think looking back, there are two huge influences that led to me deciding that borders was the theme or the wrapper that I wanted to pursue for a while. And the first one, and the most obvious one, was my time. I lived in Mexico for a while. I was actually a Mormon missionary, grew up Mormon, and so I went on a mission halfway into college, and I was assigned to go to Tijuana, which is right on a very contentious border.
Yeah,
in fact, it's the biggest border crossing in the world. It's like there's so many people and so much militarization. And I lived just a few blocks from the border wall for a long time, and just seeing that wall, that dramatic wall, the old wall that was built in, maybe the 80s or something, and then the new one that was built in the Bush administration, it's so much bigger, and it's just like it just feels like a cartoon. It's just so big and so dramatic, and it goes on for so many miles, you can't even see the end of it. That really affected me from a purely visual, visceral standpoint. I looked at that and just said, what is this that we draw lines, put up these big physical barriers and say,
this is mine.
You were born on that side and you can't touch the soil on this side because it's not yours. That really, really affected me and made me think a lot. And then, of course, I was there for 2 years listening to people's stories about how that line affected them and being deported and trying to go back and forth, and the interesting and crazy things that happened there. So that was the first kind of main one.
Makes sense.
The next one was in some political science class in college, we were reading this book, or an excerpt from this book called Imagined Communities. I think it's Benedict Arnold, maybe? I forgot the name of the guy. He's like this big scholar who does work on identity and nationalism, and his whole theory is that this is one big psychology play, that like we as humans identify with these other humans that we don't actually know because of these imagined lines that have been created. And that really fascinated me too, the notion of shared identity with strangers because of arbitrary decisions made by someone else, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, whatever it was. So all of that together said, I need to interrogate this more. I think that the impetus that started the interest in doing a series on borders was this surge in recent years of nationalism around the world, and borders really in a time of globalization, borders are having a big comeback.
Absolutely.
Fortified borders, nationalistic identity, xenophobia, all these things that just felt right. And so when it was time to make a series, I had to make a series on something. I said, borders is my thing. And that I think all of those ingredients were in the mix when I decided that.
Yeah, it's amazing how timely your series is. And also, I mean, it was taped and released, what was it, like the end December?
Yeah, in basically the end of October through the end of November. So the end of last year.
And a lot of the current events that are even coming up today. I just kept thinking back to your series and different things that were going on with the immigration train, and we'll get to that as we walk through the episodes. But speaking of the episodes, I'm very curious how you went about selecting. There's 6 episodes in this first series, and so 6 different locations. And how'd you go about choosing which locations you would be telling stories from?
It's an excruciating experience to say, pick 6 stories and you have the entire globe to choose from. And like that actually was a curse of abundance that I wish there was some constraint on, honestly, because there's just too many good ideas. So,
definitely. Well, we need more series then.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I should keep doing this for the rest of my life and just like scratch the surface of interesting border cases. So there were a few that came out of the blue that were just ones I stumbled on and just said, this feels totally right. From a personal kind of disposition standpoint, of me thinking, this feels like a visual story, something that I can point a camera at and not just talk about in words, but actually show visuals. That's a huge guiding principle. And then the aesthetic, I prioritize the texture and the visual texture of the work I do, and that to maybe some journalists those considerations would feel like, that's not relevant to the story. To me, the contrast of being in the Arctic to going to Haiti to going to the Himalaya to going to Japan, like all these places felt very different. They felt diverse, not just from a cultural standpoint, but from a texture, from an aesthetic standpoint. That really fueled my fire too. I want this to be a smattering of interesting cultures and places. And then the other thing we did is when we announced it, we called out for stories. We wanted people to submit. And so we actually got, if you watch the original announcement video, it's called "Where Should We Send Johnny Next?"
I haven't seen that.
My announcement of Borders, and that there was a link in that description to say submit your ideas, and so we got 6,000 story ideas. Borders, which was again a curse of abundance.
Yes, exactly.
It was
a little too much to sift through.
Impossible to go through them all, but through some searching and Command F to look for like the keywords that I was looking for, I was able to find some really cool ideas as well and fortify the ideas that I already had that others had submitted. And so all of that together, I mean, it was a case by case by case pitching ideas, getting feedback from editors, things like that eventually we whittled down into these. Some were just like a very clear yes, like that's easy. That's like a very natural Borders. It has the visual element. Go. The others were more deliberation. There was a lot of ideas that didn't make it through, over the bar of the editors, but eventually we settled on those 6.
Wow. Yeah. Well, excellent choices. They're all. I mean, each one is quite a journey. And if we could, I'd like to walk through the episodes a little bit, just kind of give our listeners, a taste of what these episodes have to offer. And the first one that you released was about Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and it was absolutely remarkable that how these 2 countries, how different they are, and that they share the same island. And as you point out, if you're born in Haiti, you are 2.5 times more likely to die as a baby than if you're born in the Dominican, and you'll be almost 10 times poorer, and you can expect to have a much shorter life. And And the question you pose is, how did the line, which is the border, create two totally different worlds? And I don't expect you to expound in detail, but I was wondering if you could speak on the complexities of the answer to that, the many factors that led to this situation.
Yeah. The big takeaway from that story, and it's a great case study because it is one island that has two totally different outcomes, and so you can kind of study it in this interesting comparative way. The big takeaway is that colonialism, we talk about it as one big thing. Colonialism is when European nations go out and take over other nations, and that's it. What I learned in that story is that not all colonialism or imperialism is created equal. Yeah. There are very different ways in which massive, powerful nations go and exploit or settle in or invest in other places around the world. And so the project of colonialism, especially in the 1800s, post-Columbus days of discovering the New World, those provide so many different examples of how Spain and Portugal and France and the UK exploited these places. And what I learned is that the way France treated Haiti versus how Spain treated what is now the Dominican Republic made all the difference. Yeah. France exploited the land, exploited the people, brought in a ton of slaves, just used it as a commodity, whereas Spain invested its people, invested its cultural capital, invested in marrying with the locals, all of these things. It's not by any means, they were not benevolent, colonizers, but they did things differently. And they set up a more sustainable economy and political system that gave the Dominican Republic a much better chance of surviving than Haiti, which was basically set out for failure from the beginning because of the situation. There's many other specifics that contribute to that I go into in the video, but to me that was a big theme in the whole thing. Yeah, that kind of set the foundation for kind of how things went awry. And I think we'd be remiss to say that Haiti, when it became the first Black Republic, the world isolating them because they were a Black Republic and the racism involved and everything like that. The episode centers on a border market. It's established between the two nations to give vendors from both sides a place to trade on equal footing. But what we find out is that it's far from equal. And were you really surprised about what you found when you came upon this market and just how Haitians were being treated and how that was taking place? Yeah, I actually, when I went to that market, I was looking specifically for examples of cooperation. That was truly my angle. I went
That's
to
fascinating
go show
to hear because
there still is cross-cultural collaboration, and there's this interesting kind of place where they go and I went on this nighttime journey on these boats.
7 hours, right?
With all these women. What's that?
Was it 7 hours, that trip, or something?
Yeah,
I know it was lengthy.
The craziest. Yeah, we got on these old rickety boats that were made out of wood and sailed because there was a mountain range that they couldn't have. They couldn't drive over. Okay, I was wondering. And so we went through the night to basically. We couldn't go during the day because it was too hot. So it was we'd have to go in the night and. It was crazy. So we went through the night, arrive at 4 a.m, walk to the border, and there's this market that the Dominicans control. It was set up to be this binational, transitory place, but it turns into this place where actually the Dominican border guards set it up so that the Dominicans can enter first and set up in the best stalls and have the best opportunity to start buying and selling. And then once that's all happened, they let the Haitians in to come buy and sell. And it's just an example of how an already kind of privileged, underdeveloped people have just been kind of continued or exacerbated in a trajectory that they've already been set by, much older forces. True. Kick them when they're down in some ways. It's exactly. That was wild. But just the ideas of regulation programs and constitutions being rewritten. That's terrifying, and that was discussed in this episode as well. And what was it that happened politically in 2010 in Haiti that led? I think you mentioned 20,000 Haitians ended up stateless, and this was just a recent thing that occurred. Yeah. So the Dominican Republic. for a variety of different reasons, is trying to normalize their immigration system, basically to clamp down. It's one of many expressions around the world of governments saying, hey, we need to fortify what our country means and what it, and immigration is a big part of that for a lot of people. Outsiders coming in change the nature of a nation according to these people, and therefore they need to make sure they're controlling who comes in and out of their country, which actually to me is a totally fine endeavor. A sovereign state is allowed to do that.
Sure, of course.
What the issue here is that it used to be that if you were the son or daughter of an illegal immigrant, you would become a citizen, like here in the United States. If someone comes from El Salvador illegally but then has a child, that child is a citizen. That's how it was in the Dominican Republic.
Yep.
So a lot of illegal immigrants from Haiti went into the Dominican Republic, had children, had families, integrated into Dominican life. Those children were citizens, and it was fine. There was still overt discrimination and racism in the society and amongst the people, but legally these people were fine. They were considered citizens. And in 2010 they changed the Constitution. They basically retroactively said all the people who actually were born here, going all the way back to 1929 or something. All those people actually are now not citizens. We're changing the law to that idea of being born to an illegal immigrant. You're now not a citizen, and it's retroactively applies to everyone. So all of these people, I think it's actually, I could be wrong, I'm kind of dusty on the stats here. I think it's closer to like 150 or 200,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent became stateless.
That's crazy.
And a lot of them were thrown back into Haiti.
Living in
they
camps,
gave them an opportunity to put themselves on a register to start to go through this process of getting citizenship. A lot of people didn't even have the paperwork to even start that register, so they were excluded from it. So anyway, it was a highly condemned structural situation under the guise of controlling immigration and normalizing immigration. But the true effect of it was to exterminate these illegal immigrants and their children who were citizens. Yeah, and that's been highly criticized by the entire world.
I think you show our mayor here in New York criticizing it in some of the footage, but that's just, that just blew my mind. That's crazy. But so there's no real way to kind of segue smoothly into episode 2 because it's such a different location as you were talking.
And that's kind of intentional. I want this to be the through line is borders. Yep. But borders are everywhere and they have different flavors wherever you go.
Absolutely. And this one dealt with the Arctic in Russia, and it was this one. I care a lot and I talk a lot about climate change, and this kind of comes into play here, and not only how it's going to affect us down the line, but how it affects us and is pertinent today. And while our current government in the United States is denying the problem, other countries, particularly as pointed out in this episode by you, in Russia, are taking notice and noticing that the Arctic Ocean's ice has melted and there's a new accessibility. And Russians, as you show, the Russian interest in this area is peaking. And what do they have to gain? Can you tell us a little bit about why they're why they're putting so much energy into the region?
Yeah, it's interesting that climate change is often framed as this disaster. That it is going to be this idea of really terrible outcomes for a lot of people, whether it's sea levels or changing weather, extreme weather, whatever. For Russia, they see this as a big opportunity because what it means is that a new ocean is being created at their doorstep. Russia's never really had access to big swaths of ocean.
Oh, that's true.
Because the ocean that they've had access to is frozen all the time. And so an ocean isn't very useful when it's frozen. And so the Arctic kind of been ignored by the world until recently, that every year the ice melts faster and more extreme, and then it refreezes, but then the next year melts even more, to the point where now Chinese container ships can go through this new ocean for large amounts of the summer. Now, when the ice is at its lowest point, they're able to go through and make a trip to these Western markets and cut weeks off of their trip in order to make the commerce more fluent between the places. And so there's this huge economic opportunity from a shipping standpoint. Russia also sees this as a resource chase too. Mm-hmm. There is oil and gas under the Arctic.
Yeah, I think you said 30% of the world's unknown natural gas. That's crazy.
Is an estimate by the Geological Association here in the United States. That 30% of the untapped reserves are up there. There's minerals and mines up there that are untapped, and Russia, who has a big energy mining operation all over the country. A lot of those mining operations are drying up out in Siberia. A lot of that natural gas that they've depended on for a long time, and that is a big deal because they have a lot of leverage with their energy supply that that they export. And so they're seeing this as almost a promise for the future. As our energy declines domestically, we have new reserves that are opening up. That's just one of the many facets. The other one is military. Yep. Russia, of course, likes to flex their muscles in this very kind of postury way, in this macho way, and especially the current President Putin really loves that tactic of showing the world that Russia's powerful. And the Arctic represents a way to do that. As it gets more attention, for Putin to be able to say, we have this many military bases, and we do these training exercises, and we have this many nuclear submarines, and all these things in that region. What he's saying is, look, this is our neighborhood, and you should respect that as it gets more and more attention.
Absolutely, definitely flexing muscles in a way. Yeah, the whole episode, there was so much to learn. I mean, you talk about soft power a bunch, and then these insightful information about the continental shelf, and you're even at one point wielding an explosive proof camera. That was pretty
yeah.
Nice.
There's this interesting coal mining town on this weird island that, kind of going on the theme of borders, doesn't have any borders. It actually belongs to dozens of different countries under this treaty that says that dozens of countries can be there and even exploit the resources there. None of those countries are allowed to have any sort of military. Technically it belongs to Norway, but it blurs the line of what sovereignty is because you have all these different countries that are there, and a lot of countries are there, usually for research stations. But Russia, in its attempt to continue to project, has a coal mining operation there. It doesn't make any money. It loses money. It's subsidized by the government. Yep. But they have this little town and this coal mine in order to basically say, look, we have a presence here, and we're kind of projecting our, not in a military way, but in the soft power way. And it's a really peculiar spectacle because you have all these Russians that live there, and again, they're not making money for anyone. They're just there as placeholders for the Russian government and broader Russian interests. Yeah.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. And your late night hikes look pretty amazing as well.
Late night hikes that happen to look like sunset. It's a crazy phenomenon to be up at the top of the world during summer,
if you have that much light,
the sun is setting. It feels like for 7 or 8 hours. It just is always setting. It just stays right next to the horizon.
That's so crazy.
And it kind of blows your mind. You feel like you're in like the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, it must feel completely surreal. Episode 3 was equally as fascinating. It's an episode about a North Korean bubble in Japan. A community of about 150,000 Koreans living there, and they're essentially living life as a North Korean in Japan. And it's like this bubble community, and I guess the question is, how did that bubble come to be? And
it all started back in the Japanese Empire. Japan basically used to take over big swaths of East Asia. That was their thing in the early 1900s. They were expanding. They were very powerful. And one of the places that they took over was the peninsula of Korea, which was one region. It wasn't divided like we know it today. It was just Korea.
Yep, no north and south. Yeah.
So they took that over and brought over a lot of Koreans to Japan to work and to serve in the military, and they brought over a lot of women to serve as comfort women on the front lines, essentially for the soldiers. They used them like a lot of colonizers do. They used people for different means. Once Japan lost that giant empire, i.e. when they lost World War II, they lost all of that territory, and Korea was then split up between the victors being the USSR, Russia, what we know as Russia today, and the United States was another victor. They split it up. USSR said, we'll take the North and establish something here. You take the South, you establish something there in the United States. And there was kind of a conflict there as the Cold War was ramping up. Well, while that all was happening, there was still a bunch of Koreans left in Japan. Some went back to the peninsula, but a lot stayed in Japan and kind of made a life there because they'd been there for many years. And so as soon as the Korean peninsula was divided between this pro-Soviet North and this pro-American South, the Koreans in Japan were like, wait, we were just Koreans, and now we have to decide, are we South Korean or are we North Korean? And a lot of them chose South Korean, but a lot of them were like, this North Korean regime actually seems way better. They're sending us money. They're helping us build schools. They're helping us keep our Korean identity alive. And at that time, Kim Il-sung, who was the founder of North Korea, was sending all sorts of support to this community in Japan. And so they were like, of course we're going to side with the North. They're helping us as we're kind of oppressed in this society. And so they became North Koreans. And back then, North Korea wasn't nearly as crazy as it is today. In fact, South Korea was even poorer, and North Korea was actually the richer of the two.
Oh, wow.
And so it was actually a rational decision. It was kind of, I put myself in those shoes. If I were in 1960,
yeah, you might choose that.
I would be like, I'd choose Kim Il-sung. Like, he seems like a pretty cool guy, and like establishing this sweet socialist republic. Like, I'm into that. And then things, I mean, we know the rest of the story. North Korea turns crazy, turns this hermit kingdom, turns into this oppressive place. But that fondness, that affinity, that connection to the Kim regime in North Korea as a symbol of support is still in the hearts of these people. Yep. And those schools and those institutions that Kim Il-sung donated to and built in Japan still exists. Like, those institutions still exist, and they still have his fingerprints all over it. And so there's this weird bubble of North Koreans in Japan who very closely identify with North Korea, even though they don't live there, and they've never lived there.
Yeah, that was mind blowing to me, and also it just shows that borders can be defined as different things. They in this case the border was made of culture, language, and ideology. An example, and these are your words, how they could be in our minds, live in our minds as they do on maps, and that was wild. And it also just shows the complexity of so many of these issues that you tackle, and you showed both sides real well on that one too. And just because there was the people who didn't want to stay there, and I don't know. It's just a great job.
There's a lot going on there.
A lot. It was really
a lot of pulling back and forth, and I felt that personally while I was there. In terms of I don't obviously sympathize with North Korea.
Totally.
But these people are also victimized. These North Koreans are victimized in Japanese society.
Yep.
And so I sympathize with them, but they sympathize with this horrible regime. It really starts to tug at all sorts of these categories that you want to create. And that, to me, is a really healthy thing for me, at least, to continue to kind of dismantle some of those easy categories to show that identity isn't as neat as like good versus bad.
Absolutely.
There's so many different dimensions to that, and I think this story highlights it probably better than any other because of the peculiar situation they're in.
Absolutely, you could tell you took the effort to really show a lot of different angles on that and perspective, so it's really helped. And that's what your series does such a good job of is kind of showing in an easily understood way complex situations. And I mentioned earlier how a lot of these current events come up. Episode 4 deals with Mexico and Guatemala and border crossings, and the episode helped me actually get my head around the humanitarian crisis in Central America and how it relates to the current news with the so-called immigrant caravan and how these people are fleeing from war and in need of serious help. What was it like being around the migrants that were searching so hard for a better life?
Yeah, that to me was the biggest eye-opener in all these stories, was being with the people. Reading from afar, you can create opinions and thoughts and ideas and empathy, but there's nothing like being there and hearing people say, they burned my house down.
Yeah, this one was heartbreaking.
Kill me. Yeah, it really was. And
the Honduras father crying at one point were like really affecting.
Yeah,
It was real.
It's really, really real, and it makes me feel, the crisis in Central America that's having all these people flee really reframes the conversation of immigration from the buckets that we usually think of drugs, and there's all this drug and terrible drug smuggling, and that should be enforced or blocked. And then there's the other bucket of economic migrants, people who are leaving their country because there's not a lot of economic opportunity. This is a different camp, and it should be treated differently.
Yes.
This is people who are not safe in their own country and literally fear for their lives and have a very credible threat to their lives. And we as the world have signed all these conventions that say, yes, those people are treated differently. We as the world, basic humanity dictates that we treat those people differently. We give them protection. Mm-hmm. And what I learned through this is that while once they get to the United States, we often there's obviously a lot of failures in that system of how we protect those people. Asylum seekers is what we call them.
Yep.
There's a lot of flaws in that process, but we do a pretty good job of at least giving someone a space and a space to talk about their issues and make the case.
Yeah.
Obviously, I have a lot of critiques, but the bigger critique I have is that the United States is way of stopping people from even getting to the border where they have to give them this process is by sending a bunch of money and supplies to Mexico and saying, Mexico, do your part in stopping these people from getting to us because they have to pass through your country in order to get to our country. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. did that in 2014.
Yep.
As soon as there was a lot of Central Americans starting to come to our borders, they said, we're going to have Mexico step in and crack down on these people.
That was the point where non-Mexican immigrants passed for the first time.
Yeah, for the first time.
Yeah,
there was more Central Americans coming to the border than Mexicans, and that had never happened. And it was because of these wars that are happening in Central America, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and El Salvador, and Guatemala. Yeah, all these countries were just terrible things. So that's when the U.S. was like, we need to somehow stop the flow. And I mean, you can watch the episode and see all the different mechanisms they used to do that, and the outcomes that occurred because of that crackdown. How it made it more dangerous for migrants. They didn't stop coming. That's the thing. It's like it didn't actually deter anyone. It just made things a lot worse for those who were coming, those who were already fleeing a very violent situation.
Yeah, it's at one point, like I mentioned, how this was a heartbreaking one. 40,000 children entered into Mexico in 2016, and looking for protection, looking for help, and I guess only 1% applied for protection. It's pretty dire.
And Mexico has signed all of those same conventions. Like that they say we're protectors as well. We will protect anyone who's fleeing for their lives. But when you have 40,000 children entering your country looking for protection, and 1% actually get asylum status, you clearly they're not actually complying with these conventions they've signed.
Not by any means. But so episode 5 took us to one of the highest borders on Earth in Nepal and Himalaya mountains. It's and we were brought upon a place where people sought out to seek refuge from borders. Non-state spaces is what this one's about, and I didn't even know about it's the people of Zomia is what we're the focus of. It's a range of mountains where people live without the help of government or states, and that was fascinating and inspiring. And I actually kind of saw it as an example of how people could live in like health and harmony without a centralized government. Were these communities flourishing without a formation of state? They were doing okay, right?
Yes, certainly, and it comes down to your definition of flourishing or thriving. For thousands of years, these communities who, again, like you said, intentionally went into the mountains to flee because either they were being persecuted by the government or they were, a minority. Mm-hmm. They fled, and you have this patchwork of languages and communities deep in these mountains that have thrived. They've developed lifestyles that are sustainable, that don't need the constructs of broader society and broader economies and connection that we're all used to and that most of the world is informed by. And so certainly they were able to survive in harsh conditions and able to develop, a peaceful lifestyle that didn't require some of the terrible byproducts of slavery and taxes, famine, pandemics, all of these things that are the result of humans' desire to create bigger and bigger and bigger groups that all live together. They were able to escape some of those things.
Yeah.
Now we're in a world where a lot of those things are being solved for in certain ways, and obviously we're far away from that. But there's great prosperity in what the global economy has done, and in that way, these people, and this is kind of the crux of the story, is even though they've lived away from borders for many years, as the borders and as the state forces slowly encroach and make their way into the mountains, people are embracing that and saying, yeah, I would love to have a tractor instead of a plow. I would love to have cash-based economy instead of having to trade my alfalfa from my field. Like, people are actually embracing that because they're rational economic actors and they want a better, more comfortable life. But with that also comes the erosion of a lot of these traditions, a lot of these traditional lifestyles, and the people who are still stuck in those traditional lifestyles. I talked to some yak herders.
Yeah, the nomadic family. That was wild. Yeah.
Yeah. They just move around the region herding their yak and having their yak.
They just follow the herd. That's how they decided where to live.
That's the lifestyle, and they were able to fit into the economy and the society of the mountains without the state. But now that the state is there and there's cash and there's money coming from China and there's goods coming from China, they don't fit in anymore, and now they're the losers. And they would love to be able to participate and have a house and settle down. Sure. But there's going to be a lot of losers in this transition from non-state space to the kind of the encroachment of these state concepts that these cultures are not super used to.
Yeah, absolutely. Another instance too, where you showed both sides. People who weren't going to fit in, and people who there's a road that was being built in after China put up a fence on the border with Nepal that was making life easier and better for many. So
totally. It's a mixed bag, and I went in again with this notion of kind of demonizing the state forces and saying, look at these state forces eroding the culture and like how terrible that all these beautiful old cultures are being dumbed down by capitalism. Yep. And look at all the smog from all these vehicles on the road. That of course was my like privileged mindset of being able to look at and almost glorify these old cultures as quaint and pure, and without realizing that these people themselves actually are excited about these changes. They're not. They're the victims in a lot of ways, but they're also the benefactors, and that is a hard, from someone who does want to glorify those old cultures and retain those old cultures from the comfort of my living room. Yeah. I had to come to terms with the fact that these are the people living on the front lines. They're going to decide for themselves how they balance their old traditions with the incoming economic opportunities. It's not my place to try to impose some idealistic view on that.
Romanticism of the times before,
Exactly, yeah.
So you took us from the one of the highest borders to Europe's most fortified border in Morocco in episode 6, where it was discussed in Spain and Morocco, and it focused on a piece of land that, while in Africa, is actually a piece of Europe, and it featured an intense border wall, one that our president right now would be certainly jealous of. That thing was
yeah, I totally would.
That was something else. But yeah, so the extremes that the migrants in Morocco were going through to get across this border, and how they charged en masse, and it was really intense what they were willing to do. How bad is the situation there? What I mean, they're obviously fleeing from the South Africa.
Yeah. A lot of people are coming from sub-Saharan Africa, from Cameroon, from all these places that are not really. I mean, they're kind of in the region, but they've come a long way. Yeah. And this place particularly is a magnet for migrants because it is a gateway into Europe. It's the only piece of land that has a land border with Africa. There's a lot of ways to get into Europe through the sea, but those are very dangerous. And so people think this might be safer if they can come to this little tiny piece of land. It's a holdover from colonial times, and if they can jump over and just step their feet on that soil, they're in Europe technically, and they are again brought in and treated as asylum seekers or whatever. They have to be processed. And so a lot of people see that as the goal. If I can just step my shoes over this fence and touch that piece of land, I am in Europe. And the Spanish have made it very, very difficult to do just that. Yeah. I mean, this is a tiny, tiny piece of land. Like this is like a town of like maybe I think it's like 50,000 people.
Yeah, I think you said 86,000, and it's Melilla, right? Yeah.
It's like a small little place, and it feels very Spanish.
Yeah, it looked like Spain when I was there. Yeah.
Parts of the town, and you see this wall, and it's not just one wall; it's 7 layers of walls. And I can diagram it.
Yep.
Barbed wire, ditches, flexible fences that are harder to climb. But what these guys do is, it's usually guys because they are able to like swarm and climb and do all this stuff together, and they band together to do this. Mm-hmm. They do it in the hundreds. They gather like 150 or 200 people, and they all do it at the same time to overwhelm the guards, so that a few of them will make it over, even if most of them get caught.
Yeah, a lot of them are sacrificing themselves, so just some get through.
Yeah, and calling back to what happened in the Mexico situation, mm-hmm. where the U.S. paid Mexico to do some of its dirty work,
there's a parallel there,
stopping migrants. Exact same dynamic is happening here. Spain and the EU are paying Morocco. They have a very tight relationship, and they effectively pay them to be their migration managers, to be the front line, the buffer, to stop these people. And the Moroccans have much less scrutiny over how they treat these migrants, and so the outcomes you can imagine there are much more extreme in terms of the human abuse that have been.
Yeah,
pretty heavily. So, it's a pretty ugly situation in terms of how these people are treated. Mm-hmm. But it's not an easy situation to solve, unless you're for open borders. It's a really ugly situation in terms of the human outcomes, the mm-hmm. suffering and such. But it's not an easy one to solve either. Even with the most liberal policies of openness and connection, this is just a situation. A lot of these are economic migrants who are going to Europe for economic reasons, not necessarily asylum, and there's a lot of them because there's a lot of really poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa that produce very dire circumstances, and these people come to this little piece of land to try and look for a better life, and they go through some pretty terrible things in the process.
Yeah, I mean the series as a whole does just such an amazing job of really letting viewers know just how tough so many people have, and the extremes they'll go to get a better life for themselves and for their family. And I think you point out towards the end of the last one, there's a record number of displaced people throughout the world and in need, and it's just it's really amazing. That's why the series is so special in that way. It's eye opening. What are there going to be more episodes coming? Is there going to be season 2?
There are. So
fantastic.
Very soon, I will be announcing a second. I don't want to call it a season because it's a little different in terms of its format. But suffice it to say, Borders is coming back, and I'll be doing the same thing, going to border regions and diving into interesting topics and looking for interesting people and communities and trying to make sense of it all and explain the macro context behind it all. So Borders 2 coming soon.
Fantastic. Good. Well, be safe out there. Keep telling these stories. They're so important. I mean, I'm blown away by the thing. I'm so excited to share this series and push it more and let people know what you're doing is incredibly important. And I love how you explain things, visually and verbally in a way that's incredibly, understandable. It's really it's important work what you're doing. So keep it up, and thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. Glad to be on the show.
Yeah. And
go on. I'll plan to hit stop on this recorder and send you the file from my end.
Fantastic.
So you've got it, and you can let me know if you need any info from me regarding anything else. Happy to provide whatever.
Awesome. I'm going to be providing links for everybody to get to all the videos on YouTube and everything there. So thank you everyone out there for taking another trip with us beyond the margin.
Osiris. This podcast is in the Loop, the Legion of Osiris podcasts. What does that mean? Osiris is a community of great music and culture podcasts. If you like this one, go check out others at osirispod.com and get in the loop. Osiris is partnered with Relics Magazine at relics.com.
Across the margin.
Across the Margin Podcast.